The early morning air was crisp, and the park was quiet except for the faint rustle of leaves. Ronnie Reynolds jogged along the familiar path, enjoying the solitude. The world still felt half asleep, and he liked it that way. With his hoodie pulled up and earbuds in, he was just another guy taking advantage of the peaceful dawn. As he rounded a bend, something unusual caught his eye. Near a bench ahead, a scruffy, medium-sized dog sat, its fur a mix of brown and white, matted and dusty. The dog wasn't just sitting idly, it was staring intently at a tunnel under a nearby bridge. Its tail twitched nervously, and every few seconds, it let out a sharp bark as though trying to get someone's attention. Ronnie slowed down, pulling out his earbuds. The dog's barking was sharp, urgent, but not aggressive. It seemed like it was trying to communicate something. Intrigued, Ronnie stopped a few feet away and observed. The dog didn't look lost or scared. Instead, it seemed focused, almost determined. "What's up, buddy?" Ronnie called out softly, stepping closer. The dog glanced at him, its ears perking up for a moment. Then, without warning, it darted toward the tunnel, disappearing into the shadows. Ronnie hesitated, his curiosity piqued. He approached the tunnel's entrance, crouching slightly to get a better look. The dog's barks echoed from deep inside, faint but consistent. The tunnel itself wasn't particularly large, just big enough for a person to crouch through, and it stretched further than it appeared from the outside. "Why am I even thinking about this?" Ronnie muttered to himself. He glanced around the park, but there was no one else in sight. With a resigned sigh, he crouched down and crawled into the tunnel. The cold, damp air hit him immediately, and the faint smell of earth and mildew filled his nose. The tunnel was darker than he expected, with only slivers of light filtering in through small cracks above. His hands brushed against the rough walls as he moved forward, the sound of his breathing amplified in the narrow space. The dog's barks grew louder, guiding him deeper into the tunnel. "This better not be a setup for some underground dog gang," Ronnie joked under his breath, trying to shake off the growing unease. As he continued, he began noticing small, unsettling details. Claw marks scraped across the walls as though something had been dragged through the tunnel. Scattered debris littered the ground, an old soda can, a torn piece of cloth, and what looked like a rusted bolt. Each step forward seemed to amplify the sense that something strange had happened here. Finally, Ronnie's hand brushed against something snagged on the wall. He paused, reaching up to pull it free. It was a small piece of fabric, torn and stained. Holding it closer to the faint light from the cracks above, he noticed faintly embroidered initials. JT. He frowned, tucking the fabric into his pocket before moving on. The air grew colder as he pressed forward. A faint light appeared in the distance, a small round glow that promised the tunnel's end. The dog's barking had stopped now, replaced by soft whines that echoed faintly back toward him. "Almost there," Ronnie muttered, picking up his pace. His curiosity had morphed into a quiet determination to see this through. When he finally emerged from the tunnel, he found himself in a clearing surrounded by dense woods. The early morning light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. The dog was sitting a few feet away, wagging its tail, but its focus was on something ahead. Ronnie followed its gaze and froze. Through the trees, partially hidden by overgrown bushes, was a dilapidated building. Its windows were shattered, and graffiti covered its crumbling walls. The structure looked like it had been abandoned for years, yet something about it felt alive, as though it still held secrets waiting to be uncovered. The dog barked again, snapping Ronnie out of his thoughts. It stood, wagging its tail more insistently, and trotted toward the building. Ronnie sighed, wiping his hands on his hoodie. All right, I'm coming," he said, following the dog through the overgrowth. He had no idea what he was walking into, but one thing was clear: this was no ordinary stray dog, and this was no ordinary morning jog. Ronnie stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the abandoned building ahead. The place looked like something straight out of a horror movie. Broken windows, rusted doors, and crumbling walls gave it an eerie vibe. Overgrown weeds stretched up toward the building's faded graffiti, and the faint sound of the wind passing through broken pipes added an unsettling soundtrack. The dog barked again, pulling Ronnie's attention. It was standing near what looked like the main entrance, its tail wagging and nose pressed against the old door. "You really want me to follow you in there, huh?" Ronnie muttered. The dog glanced back at him as if to say, "Hurry up." Ronnie took a deep breath. "Okay, fine," he said, stepping toward the building. "But if this turns into some Scooby-Doo mystery with actual ghosts, I'm out." The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, and the smell of damp wood and rust hit him immediately. Inside, the air was cooler, and dust floated in the beams of light streaming through the shattered windows. The interior was just as abandoned as the outside. Scattered tools, rusted metal pieces, and broken furniture were everywhere. It looked like an old factory or warehouse, left to rot for years. The dog trotted ahead confidently, weaving between broken chairs and piles of debris. Ronnie followed, stepping carefully to avoid jagged pieces of glass on the floor. "You've been here before, haven't you?" he said, watching the dog sniff the ground as if searching for something. The deeper they went, the darker it got. Ronnie turned on the flashlight on his phone, the beam cutting through the shadows. He noticed faint footprints in the thick layer of dust on the floor. They looked fresh, leading further into the building. Ronnie stopped and stared at the prints. "Someone's been here recently," he whispered to himself. He felt a chill run down his spine but kept moving, the dog guiding him further. As they rounded a corner, Ronnie spotted a door at the end of a long hallway. It was heavy and metal with rusted hinges, but it looked sturdier than the rest of the place. The dog stopped in front of it and barked, pawing at the bottom of the door. "What's behind here?" Ronnie muttered, stepping closer. He ran his fingers along the door's surface, feeling the cool metal. There was a large padlock securing it, but the lock was old and rusted, barely holding together. Next to the door, Ronnie noticed a heavy pipe lying on the ground. "Well, let's see if you're as weak as you look," he said, picking up the pipe. It took a few swings, but the padlock finally broke, the brittle metal snapping with a loud clang that echoed through the empty building. Ronnie pushed the door open slowly, and it creaked loudly, the sound making him wince. The room beyond was dark, with faint light filtering through cracks in the ceiling. It was colder than the rest of the building, and the air felt heady, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. The dog ran inside, sniffing the ground and pawing at something in the corner. Ronnie followed, his flashlight sweeping across the room. At first glance, it seemed empty, but then he noticed a table against one wall. Papers were scattered across it, along with maps, a notebook, and what looked like a small broken radio. "What is this place?" Ronnie murmured, stepping closer to examine the table. The maps showed unfamiliar locations, marked with red circles. The notebook was filled with messy, hurried handwriting, most of it illegible, but a few phrases stood out: "Final shipment," "urgent coordinates," and "do not trust anyone." Ronnie frowned, flipping through the pages. The words didn't make much sense, but they felt important, like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be solved. The dog barked again, louder this time, and Ronnie turned to see it digging at a pile of old blankets in the corner. "What now?" he asked, walking over. He crouched down and pulled the blankets aside, revealing a dusty backpack underneath. He unzipped the bag and found more papers, a flashlight, and what looked like a small device with a blinking red light. Ronnie stared at it, unsure of what he was holding. "This just keeps getting weirder," he muttered. Before he could think further, a faint sound reached his ears, the crunch of footsteps on gravel outside the building. Ronnie froze, his heart racing. The dog growled low, its ears pinned back. "Someone's here," Ronnie whispered, his voice barely audible. He quickly stuffed the notebook and device back into the bag and slung it over his shoulder. The dog stood beside him, its body tense, ready for whatever was coming. Ronnie turned off his flashlight and moved quietly to the door, peeking out into the hallway. Shadows danced in the dim light as the sound of footsteps grew louder. Ronnie took a deep breath, gripping the pipe he had used earlier. "Let's hope they're friendly," he whispered, though he doubted it. The dog growled again, and Ronnie knew one thing for sure: this was no ordinary factory, and whoever was coming wasn't here by accident. Ronnie stood still, gripping the pipe tightly in one hand. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly, growing closer with each passing second. His heart pounded in his chest, and he glanced at the dog, who was crouched low, growling softly, its eyes locked on the door. The footsteps stopped. Ronnie held his breath, listening intently. The faint creak of metal followed, a door opening somewhere deeper in the building. Whoever was out there wasn't just passing by. They were searching for something, or someone. "We need to move," Ronnie whispered to the dog. The dog gave a small huff, as if agreeing, and backed away from the door. Ronnie quickly scanned the room, his flashlight still off to avoid being seen. His eyes fell on a small vent near the far wall, just big enough for the dog to squeeze through, but too small for him. "You're gonna have to lead the way again, buddy," he muttered, motioning toward the vent. The dog didn't hesitate, slipping through the narrow opening with surprising ease. Ronnie grabbed the backpack from the table and slung it over his shoulder. He took one last look at the strange maps and papers before slipping out of the room as quietly as he could. The hallway was dark, lit only by faint light streaming through broken windows. Ronnie moved slowly, staying low, his footsteps soft against the dusty floor. He followed the dog's faint movements, hearing its soft paws scurrying ahead. His hands were clammy, and his breathing felt too loud in the eerie silence. As they turned a corner, something on the wall caught his eye. Scratches, deep and deliberate, crisscrossed the surface. They weren't random marks, they formed a strange pattern, almost like symbols or writing. Ronnie stopped to examine them, running his fingers along the grooves. "What the hell is this?" he muttered. The symbols didn't look familiar, but there was something unsettling about them. They felt purposeful, like someone had carved them in a hurry, trying to leave a message. The dog barked softly from up ahead, pulling him out of his thoughts. "All right, I'm coming," Ronnie said under his breath, moving quickly to catch up. As he walked, he noticed more strange signs, footprints that didn't match his own, a streak of what looked like dried mud smeared across the floor, and a faint metallic smell in the air. The dog stopped at another doorway, sniffing the ground before barking again. Ronnie peered through the opening, finding himself in what looked like an old storage room. Rows of shelves lined the walls, though most were empty, covered in dust and cobwebs. In the middle of the room lay a large metal crate, its lid slightly ajar. The dog sniffed around it, growling softly. Ronnie approached cautiously, his pipe raised in case something, or someone, jumped out. He nudged the lid with the end of the pipe, pushing it open wider. The crate was filled with tools and supplies, ropes, flashlights, and what looked like sealed plastic containers. On top of the pile sat a small plastic card with faintly embossed text, "Restricted Access." Ronnie picked it up, flipping it over to find a barcode and a faded logo that was too smudged to read. "This just keeps getting better," he said sarcastically, tucking the card into the backpack. He glanced at the dog, who was now sniffing near the room's back wall, pawing at the ground. "What do you find now?" As Ronnie moved closer, he noticed a thin crack in the wall. It looked like a hidden door slightly ajar. The dog nudged it with its nose, pushing it open just enough for Ronnie to see inside. The space beyond was small and cramped, with nothing but a single metal box bolted to the floor. Ronnie crouched down, examining the box. It had a keypad on the front and a small screen that displayed the words, "Access code required." He shook his head, muttering, "Great. Of course it needs a code." Before he could think of his next move, a loud crash echoed through the building, followed by hurried footsteps. Someone was getting closer, and this time they weren't being quiet. Ronnie's pulse quickened as he grabbed the dog's collar, pulling it close. "We're out of time," he whispered. The dog barked sharply, as if in agreement, and led him back toward the hallway. Ronnie moved as quickly and quietly as he could, the metallic card and the images of the strange symbols burning in his mind. Whatever was going on here, it was more than he'd bargained for, and now he wasn't sure if he was going to get out unscathed. Ryan crawled out of the dark tunnel and squinted as his eyes adjusted to the daylight. He was in the middle of a wide, overgrown clearing, the ground covered in thick grass and weeds. The air smelled earthy, damp from the tunnel he had just escaped. Around him, towering trees stretched high into the sky, their leaves creating a thick canopy that barely let any sunlight through. The dog was there, waiting for him. Its tail wagged eagerly as it stood at the edge of the clearing, but its gaze was fixed on something ahead. It didn't seem like the kind of dog that would just run off, but Ryan could tell it wasn't interested in him for the moment. It was staring hard at something further into the woods, its stance tense. Ryan followed the dog's gaze, and after a few moments he saw it. Through the trees, barely visible behind the thick branches and vines, was the outline of a building. It was old, falling apart, really. The windows were broken, jagged shards of glass still clinging to the edges of the frames. The stone walls were covered in graffiti, some of it bold, some of it faded from years of exposure. The whole place looked abandoned, forgotten by time. The dog barked again, sharp and insistent, pulling Ryan out of his thoughts. The dog was waiting, its eyes locked on the building as if it wanted him to go there. Ryan hesitated, unsure of what to expect, but something about the dog's determination made him feel like he had no choice. The building seemed important, though he couldn't understand why. With a deep breath, Ryan stepped forward, his boots crunching on the dry leaves beneath his feet, and followed the dog into the woods toward the dilapidated structure. Ronnie emerged from the tunnel, standing at the edge of the clearing, staring at the abandoned building ahead. The crumbling structure loomed like a forgotten relic, its broken windows and faded graffiti giving it an eerie, unwelcoming presence. The dog stood near the entrance, wagging its tail impatiently and barking once, as if urging him forward. Yeah, I get it," Ronnie muttered. "This is where you wanted me to go, right?" The dog barked again and trotted toward the rusted door. Ronnie followed cautiously, stepping over thick weeds and shattered glass scattered across the ground. The closer he got, the more unsettling the building seemed. The wind whistled softly through the cracks, and a faint metallic smell lingered in the air. Ronnie pushed the door, which groaned loudly as it swung open. The smell of damp wood and rust hit him immediately. Inside, the air was cold and heady, filled with floating dust that danced in the dim rays of light streaming through broken windows. The dog wasted no time, darting ahead and sniffing the ground, its ears perked and nose twitching. "You're really on a mission, aren't you?" Ronnie said, stepping inside. The floor was littered with debris, pieces of rusted metal, shattered furniture, and unidentifiable junk. Ronnie stepped carefully, avoiding jagged edges and unstable floorboards. The dog moved with purpose, weaving through the mess like it knew exactly where to go. Ronnie's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out, turning on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the shadows, revealing more of the decayed interior. He noticed faint footprints in the dust, leading deeper into the building. They were recent, too fresh to belong to anyone who'd been here long ago. "Someone else has been here," Ronnie muttered, his voice low. He glanced down at the dog, which was now standing near a doorway, barking and pawing at the ground. What now? He approached the doorway and peeked inside. The room beyond was cluttered with rusted shelves and overturned crates. In the middle of the room sat a large metal locker, its door slightly ajar. The dog sniffed at it eagerly, letting out a sharp bark. "All right, let's see what's so interesting," Ronnie said, stepping closer. He carefully opened the locker wider, revealing a pile of equipment inside: ropes, flashlights, and sealed plastic containers. A folded map lay on top of the pile, its edges yellowed and worn. Ronnie grabbed the map and unfolded it. It was marked with red circles and lines, connecting what looked like specific locations. Scrawled in the corner were the words, "Final shipment coordinates, secure by any means." "What the hell is this?" Ronnie muttered, turning the map over. The other side was blank, but the cryptic words stayed in his mind. He tucked the map into his backpack, glancing at the dog. "You really know how to find trouble, don't you?" The dog growled softly, turning its attention to a nearby door. It was heavy and metal, with a rusted padlock hanging loosely from it. Ronnie stepped closer, gripping the padlock and testing its strength. It felt weak, as though it could break with a little force. "Looks like we're breaking in," Ronnie said, picking up a piece of pipe from the floor. He swung it against the lock a few times until the brittle metal snapped, the pieces clattering to the ground. The dog barked, wagging its tail as Ronnie pushed the door open. The room beyond was darker and colder, with faint light filtering through cracks in the walls. A table sat against one wall, covered in scattered papers, maps, and what looked like a broken radio. Ronnie's eyes immediately went to the maps, which were marked with more circles and scribbled notes. One phrase stood out: "Do not let this fall into the wrong hands." "What the hell have you dragged me into?" Ronnie muttered, picking up one of the papers. The dog sniffed around the room, pawing at a pile of old blankets in the corner. Ronnie crouched down and pulled the blankets aside, revealing a dusty backpack underneath. He unzipped it, finding more papers, a small flashlight, and a strange device with a blinking red light. "Great. Now we're dealing with gadgets," Ronnie said. Before he could examine it further, the dog barked sharply, its growl low and tense. Ronnie froze, listening. The faint sound of footsteps echoed through the building, growing louder. "Looks like we're not alone," Ronnie whispered. He stuffed the papers and device into his own bag, standing up quickly. The dog growled again, its body tense, as if ready for whatever was coming. Ronnie switched off his flashlight, his heart pounding. "All right, buddy," he said softly. "Time to see how fast we can get out of here." The sound of footsteps echoed louder, sending a chill down Ronnie's spine. He crouched low, gripping the pipe tightly in one hand, while the dog stood beside him, growling softly. Whoever was in the building wasn't just wandering, they were searching. Ronnie followed the dog further into the dark hallway, moving as quietly as he could. The dog stopped in front of a heavy metal door at the end of the hall, scratching at it and barking softly. "What's so important in here?" Ronnie muttered, stepping closer to examine the door. A rusted padlock hung from the handle, old enough to snap with some effort. Using the pipe, Ronnie struck the lock a few times until it broke, clattering to the floor. The dog barked and backed up, letting him push the door open. Inside, the air was colder, and dust floated in the dim light streaming through a crack in the ceiling. The room felt untouched, as if it had been sealed off for years. In the center was a table covered in papers, maps, and a broken radio. Ronnie approached cautiously, shining his flashlight. The maps were marked with red circles connecting locations, while notes scrawled across the pages read "Final shipment coordinates" and "Do not trust anyone." A small tracking device sat beside the maps, its red light blinking steadily. "What is all this?" Ronnie whispered, flipping through the papers. His attention was pulled away by the dog barking softly in the corner. It pawed a pile of old blankets, growling low. Ronnie crouched and pulled the blankets aside, revealing a small metal box with a keypad on the front. The display read, "Access code required." "Great, a locked box," Ronnie muttered. He glanced back at the table, scanning the papers for any clues, but the numbers scattered across the notebook didn't seem to match the keypad format. The dog barked again, louder this time, as if warning him. The sound of footsteps returned, growing louder and more hurried. Ronnie's heart raced as a shadow passed by the crack in the door. Whoever was here was getting closer. "Time to move," Ronnie whispered. He grabbed the notebook, stuffed it into his backpack, and slung it over his shoulder. The dog trotted to the door, staying low as it waited for him to follow. Ronnie switched off his flashlight and slipped out, keeping to the shadows. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by faint voices. Ronnie and the dog moved quickly but silently through the maze-like building. Every creak of the floorboards felt deafening, and Ronnie's grip on the pike tightened with each step. The dog led him to another door, slightly ajar. Ronnie slipped inside, shutting it gently behind them. The room was small and empty, but a single window high on the wall let in a faint glow. Ronnie glanced at the dog, who was already looking up at the window, its tail wagging slightly. "You're full of good ideas, aren't you?" Ronnie said quietly. He boosted the dog up first, watching as it leaped through the opening with ease. Then, using a crate, he hoisted himself up and squeezed through. As he landed on the ground outside, Ronnie let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The dog stood nearby, its ears alert and tail wagging slightly. "All right," Ronnie said, tightening the straps at his backpack. "Let's figure out what we just walked into." Ronnie crouched behind a stack of crates outside the building, catching his breath. The dog stood beside him, alert, its ears twitching at every sound. He opened his backpack, pulling out the notebook and flipping through its pages. The messy handwriting and scattered diagrams made it hard to understand, but one phrase caught his eye: "Final shipment coordinates." The dog barked softly, drawing Ronnie's attention. It trotted to another entrance, pawing at the door. "You're really not done, are you?" Ronnie muttered, following cautiously. He pushed the door open, stepping into another dimly lit room. The air inside was cold, with a faint metallic smell lingering in the shadows. The dog sniffed around, circling a pile of old boxes in the corner. Ronnie watched as it pawed at the floorboards, growling low. "All right, let's see what you found now," he said, kneeling down. He shifted the boxes aside and uncovered a small hidden compartment in the floor. Inside was a dusty metal container, its lid slightly ajar. Ronnie opened it carefully, revealing a stack of papers and a small black device with a blinking red light. The papers were maps, marked with lines and circles, and notes scribbled in the margins like "checkpoints active" and "secure before midnight." Ronnie's brow furrowed. "This is way more than just some abandoned building," he whispered. He tucked the papers into his bag, examining the device for a moment before doing the same. "Whatever this is, it's important." The dog barked sharply, its growl intensifying. Ronnie froze, listening. Faint voices echoed from deeper in the building, growing louder. "They're still looking," he muttered, standing quickly. The dog nudged his leg, leading him toward a side door. Ronnie followed, stepping lightly to avoid making noise. The door led to a narrow hallway with cracked walls and scattered debris. As they moved, Ronnie noticed fresh footprints in the dust, large and hurried, heading in the same direction they were. The dog stopped suddenly, sniffing the ground near another door. It barked once and scratched at the base, looking back at Ronnie. He opened the door slowly, revealing a small storage room. Shelves lined the walls, most of them empty, but a large crate sat in the center, its lid slightly open. Ronnie approached cautiously, peeking inside. The crate contained ropes, sealed plastic bags, and a clipboard with more scribbled notes. One line stood out: "Shipment ready by dawn. Deliver without delay." "This just keeps getting better," Ronnie muttered, tucking the clipboard into his bag. The dog growled again, louder this time, and Ronnie turned to see shadows moving in the hallway. Voices were getting closer. "We've got to go," Ronnie said, his voice low. The dog barked once in agreement, already heading toward another exit. Ronnie grabbed his bag and followed, slipping through the door into the night. As they reached the edge of the clearing, Ronnie stopped to catch his breath. He crouched next to the dog, who was watching the building intently, its ears perked. "All right," Ronnie said, patting its head. "Let's figure out where this all leads." Ronnie crouched behind a thick bush at the edge of the clearing, peering back at the abandoned building. The faint glow of his flashlight was off, leaving him in near darkness. The dog stood next to him, growling softly, its ears pinned back. Just as Ronnie was about to catch his breath, the sound of footsteps shattered the quiet. A group of men appeared, their silhouettes moving through the building's broken windows. They carried flashlights, their beams cutting through the shadows inside. "They're searching for something," Ronnie whispered, gripping the straps of his backpack tightly. The dog barked once, low and sharp, as if warning him not to stay still for long. The men emerged from the building moments later, scanning the area with their flashlights. Ronnie pressed himself lower to the ground, barely daring to breathe. "They're too close," he muttered under his breath. One of the men spoke, his voice rough and commanding. "Check the perimeter. It has to be here." The dog growled again, its body tense. Ronnie reached out to calm it, whispering, "Stay quiet, buddy. We can't get caught now." The men split into smaller groups, each heading in a different direction. Ronnie knew he couldn't stay hidden for long. The dog seemed to sense his thoughts, nudging his leg and gesturing with its nose toward a narrow path leading into the dense woods. "Good idea," Ronnie murmured. "Let's move." The two crept away silently, the dog leading him through the thick underbrush. The voices of the men faded slightly, but Ronnie didn't let his guard down. As they moved deeper into the woods, the dog suddenly stopped, sniffing the air. It barked softly, then started trotting toward a faint glimmer of light in the distance. "What now?" Ronnie whispered, following closely. The light grew brighter as they approached, revealing a small clearing with an old shed partially hidden by vines and overgrowth. The shed's door was slightly ajar, and the faint sound of a generator hummed from inside. Ronnie hesitated, peering through the cracked door. The shed was filled with crates, some open and others sealed tightly with heavy locks. A small table sat in the corner, covered in tools and an open map similar to the one Ronnie had found earlier. He stepped inside cautiously, the dog right behind him. As he approached the table, he noticed something alarming, a photo lying next to the map. The image was grainy, but it showed a familiar figure. It was him, standing near the tunnel earlier that day. Ronnie's stomach dropped. "They know who I am," he muttered. He quickly stuffed the map and photo into his backpack, scanning the crates for anything else useful. Most of them were sealed, but one partially open box caught his eye. Inside were bundles of cash, neatly stacked and wrapped. "This is way bigger than I thought," Ronnie whispered, his voice barely audible. He stepped back, glancing at the dog, who was sniffing near the shed's back wall. Before he could investigate further, the sound of voices returned, closer this time. "They'd got to be here somewhere," one of the men shouted. Ronnie's heart raced. He motioned to the dog, and the two of them slipped out the back of the shed, disappearing into the woods once more. The dog led him along a narrow trail, weaving expertly through the trees. As they put more distance between themselves and the shed, Ronnie slowed down to catch his breath. He crouched next to the dog, his mind racing. "They know I'm involved now," he said softly, gripping the backpack. "We're in deep, buddy." The dog barked once, its tail wagging slightly, as if urging him to keep going. Ronnie nodded, his resolve hardening. "All right, let's figure out what these guys are hiding before they catch up to us." Together, they vanished further into the woods, the glow of flashlights fading behind them. Ronnie and the dog moved quickly through the woods, staying low to the ground. The sounds of the men's voices and footsteps were getting louder, echoing through the trees. Ronnie's heart raced as he kept his eyes on the dog, who was leading the way with a steady pace, ears alert and body tense. "We can't stop now," Ronnie whispered, his breath coming in short bursts. The dog barked softly, urging him to keep going. Ronnie glanced over his shoulder, knowing they couldn't afford to be caught. The men were close, too close for comfort. The dog dashed ahead, weaving through the trees with speed Ronnie couldn't match. He pushed himself harder, dodging branches and low-hanging vines. The forest was dense, but the dog seemed to know exactly where to go, always a few steps ahead. Ronnie's legs were starting to burn, but he didn't dare slow down. The sound of the men grew closer, and he could hear the snap of twigs under their boots as they closed in on him. "Stay ahead, buddy," Ronnie urged, watching the dog disappear ahead of him. The dog was moving faster now, its body low to the ground. Ronnie pushed himself harder, his breaths coming faster. He was close to losing sight of the dog, but then he heard the bark again, a sharp, urgent sound. Ronnie picked up his pace, catching a glimpse of the dog as it slid through a narrow gap between two trees. He reached the spot just as the dog paused, looking back at him. The dog's tail wagged briefly, and Ronnie caught his breath. They were near a small creek, its water gurgling softly in the background. The dog dashed forward, heading toward a thicket of bushes on the other side of the creek. Ronnie followed, crossing the creek with a leap. He looked over his shoulder and saw one of the men break through the tree line, just a few yards behind him. "Come on, buddy," Ronnie whispered, trying to keep the panic from his voice. The dog was already through the bushes and moving toward a set of large rocks. Ronnie reached the rocks just in time to see the dog scramble up the side, reaching a higher ledge. Ronnie followed the dog, using the rocks to help propel himself up. He reached the top just as the sound of footsteps stopped behind him. He peeked over the ledge, watching the men stop at the creek, their flashlights sweeping back and forth. "Where the hell did he go?" one of the men muttered, frustration clear in his voice. Ronnie stayed still, holding his breath as the men scanned the area. He could hear their muffled voices, but he didn't dare move. The dog stayed low beside him, its eyes watching the men below. After what felt like forever, the men turned back and began walking in the opposite direction. Ronnie exhaled slowly, his muscles still tense with fear. The dog nudged his leg, giving a small whimper as if asking if it was safe to move. Ronnie stood up and motioned for the dog to follow. "That was too close," he muttered, glancing around to make sure they weren't being followed. The dog stayed close, and together they moved deeper into the woods, farther away from the men. As they walked, Ronnie's mind raced. He had to figure out what the men were up to and why they were after him. The strange maps, the cryptic notes, the hidden crates. It was all connected somehow. "We'll figure this out," Ronnie whispered to the dog. The dog barked softly, as if agreeing. Ronnie knew they had to move quickly, but the dog had proven itself to be more than just a guide. It had helped them escape from the men, and it was beginning to feel like they were a team now. "Let's go," Ronnie said, setting off into the dark woods with the dog at his side. There was still a long way to go, but Ronnie felt a new sense of determination. The chase wasn't over, but he was ready for whatever came next. Ronnie slowed down to catch his breath, his heart still racing from the chase. The dog trotted beside him, tail wagging slightly but alert, as if sensing the danger wasn't over. They had managed to escape, but Ronnie knew they weren't out of the woods yet. There was still too much left unanswered, and the stakes were higher than ever. Sitting down on a nearby rock, Ronnie reached into his backpack and pulled out the notebook, the maps, and the small device he had grabbed from the shed earlier. The dog sat beside him, its eyes focused, waiting patiently. Ronnie flipped open the notebook, scanning the pages filled with scattered notes. Most of it was hard to read, but one thing stood out: final shipment, and to not fail. "These people are serious," Ronnie muttered, his eyes tracing the maps that were marked with red circles. The coordinates were all over the place, some far outside the city. Whoever had left this behind was clearly part of something big. Flipping through the pages, Ronnie found more notes that were equally cryptic. "Retrieve package. Deliver to drop site. Secure by midnight." He frowned. "This isn't just about stolen goods. There's something more here." He scanned the pages again, his finger stopping on a section of numbers scattered across the pages. It didn't make sense at first, but then it clicked. These are access codes, codes for something important. "These must be the key," Ronnie said, holding up the small device with the blinking red light. The device seemed simple enough, but it could be the link to everything. He turned it over in his hands, trying to make sense of it. Whatever it was, it seemed to play a crucial part in the operation. The dog barked softly, as if urging him to keep going. Ronnie smiled slightly, feeling the dog's silent support. "All right, let's figure this out." Ronnie fiddled with the device, pressing a few buttons. Suddenly, the screen flickered to life, displaying a map of the city with several locations marked on it. A few numbers flashed across the screen, and Ronnie quickly realized they were more coordinates. Exact locations where the shipments were being moved. "These are drop points," Ronnie said, his voice low but urgent. His pulse quickened as he realized what he was seeing. The locations on the map matched some of the spots marked on the paper maps in the notebook. These were the places the men were planning to deliver whatever was in the crates. Ronnie felt a sense of urgency. The men weren't just carrying out some random operation. This was organized, and it was happening right under their noses. They had to stop it. The dog barked again, more urgently this time, and Ronnie looked down at it. The dog seemed ready to move, as if it understood the gravity of the situation. Ronnie stood up, slinging the backpack over his shoulder. "We need to get to these drop points. We're running out of time." The dog followed closely behind as they moved quickly through the woods. The map and device in Ronnie's hands felt like the key to everything. But he knew it wouldn't be enough to stop the men on his own. They needed to move faster, and they needed to gather more information before it was too late. As they left the woods and made their way toward the first location on the map, Ronnie's mind raced. The men were still out there, and they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. But Ronnie wasn't about to let them succeed, not without a fight. With the dog by his side, he was ready for whatever came next. "Let's go, buddy," Ronnie said, glancing down at the dog. "We're just getting started." Ronnie and the dog moved quickly through the streets, staying in the shadows. The map was in his hand, and the coordinates on it led to a location that was just outside the city. The further they went, the more Ronnie felt the weight of the situation pressing on him. Whoever these men were, they were clearly part of something much bigger. He had to stop them, but he didn't know how close they were to completing their mission. The dog walked ahead, keeping a steady pace, as if it knew exactly where it was going. Ronnie glanced down at it, impressed by how focused the dog was. It wasn't just following a trail, it was leading him to something important. After a few more minutes of walking, they reached a quieter area, far from the busy streets. The city's noise seemed miles away, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. Up ahead, Ronnie spotted a large warehouse, hidden behind a few trees. It was the kind of place that seemed out of place, tucked away from view. The windows were boarded up, and the outside looked worn down and abandoned. "This must be it," Ronnie whispered to the dog, who was already moving toward the entrance. The dog's tail was wagging slightly, its eyes scanning the area. It seemed to know they were getting close. Ronnie slowed as they neared the door. The place was quiet, too quiet. No lights were on, and there was no sign of activity. He crouched down beside the dog, trying to get a better look. Through a small crack in the door, he could see a faint light inside, a dim glow that hinted at movement. Ronnie's stomach tightened. "We need to be careful," Ronnie whispered, taking a deep breath. He gently pushed the door open, trying to make as little noise as possible. It creaked loudly, but Ronnie ignored it, stepping inside with the dog right behind him. The warehouse was large, with tall ceilings and rows of shelves stacked with crates. Some of the crates were open, revealing what looked like parts of machinery, but others were sealed tightly. Ronnie's flashlight swept over the room, catching a glimpse of a few men moving around the back. They were talking quietly, but their voices were too muffled for Ronnie to make out what they were saying. The dog growled softly, its body tense as it stood still, watching the men in the back. Ronnie crouched low, staying behind a large pile of crates to keep out of sight. He could hear the men talking about delivery time and final shipment, but nothing that gave him the full picture. He carefully moved closer, making sure the dog stayed quiet. As he got near, Ronnie noticed a large metal door in the back of the warehouse, slightly ajar. It led to a smaller room, and from the faint glow inside, it looked like something important was stored there. He motioned to the dog, signaling that they should move quietly. They reached the door, and Ronnie carefully pushed it open. Inside was a small office area. A desk sat in the middle of the room, covered in maps, papers, and blueprints. The same red circles that had appeared on the maps earlier were drawn here too, marking specific locations. Ronnie picked up one of the papers from the desk and scanned it quickly. It detailed the final steps of the operation. Ensure shipment is delivered without delay. Coordinates confirmed. Prepare for final drop. Ronnie's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just about stolen goods. It was a well-planned operation, and the men had already moved on to the final stage. The dog barked once, its attention caught by something else in the room. Ronnie turned just in time to see the dog sniffing at a small box in the corner of the room. He moved over to it, crouching down. The box was sealed with a thick layer of tape, but a small crack in the corner revealed something shiny inside. Ronnie opened the box carefully, revealing stacks of cash wrapped in rubber bands. There was more money here than Ronnie had ever seen. It didn't make sense. Why would they need so much cash for an operation like this? Suddenly, the door to the warehouse creaked again, and Ronnie froze. The voices outside grew louder, and it sounded like the men were coming closer. Ronnie quickly grabbed the box and stuffed it into his bag, motioning for the dog to follow. They moved quickly but quietly, slipping out of the small room and back into the main warehouse. The dog led the way, its instincts guiding them through the maze of crates. They reached the door, and Ronnie pushed it open just enough to slip outside, holding his breath as the men passed by. Once they were clear of the building, Ronnie exhaled in relief. He looked down at the dog, who was panting slightly but still alert. "We got what we came for," Ronnie said, glancing at the bag. "Now we need to figure out how to stop these guys." The dog barked once, as if agreeing, and together they disappeared into the night, ready for whatever came next. Ronnie and the dog moved quickly through the city outskirts, the stolen documents and money tucked safely in his backpack. He knew they were close to the next drop point, but the closer they got, the more nervous he became. They needed to stop this operation before it went any further. The coordinates on the map had led them to a cliffside on the edge of the city. It was a quiet place, far from the busy streets, and Ronnie couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He had the sense they were being watched. The dog suddenly stopped, its ears pricked, nose twitching. It growled low, its body tense. Ronnie froze, scanning the area. Then he saw it, a figure at the edge of the cliff, watching them from the shadows. "They're here," Ronnie muttered. The men were already ahead of them. Before Ronnie could react, the figure stepped forward, and another man appeared from the side, blocking their escape. Ronnie's heart pounded as the two men closed in, their eyes locked on him. "Thought you could get away with it, huh?" one of the men sneered. Ronnie clenched his fists, ready for whatever came next. The dog barked sharply, stepping between Ronnie and the men, its body low, ready to defend. Ronnie took a step back, pulling out the device and notebook he had taken from the warehouse. "You've been moving things you shouldn't be," Ronnie said, his voice steady, "and I'm done letting you get away with it." The men laughed, clearly not intimidated. "You think you're the first to try and stop us?" The other man said, pulling out a knife from his belt. "You've got no idea what you're up against." Ronnie's mind raced. The men were dangerous, and they were prepared. He needed a way out fast. The dog lunged forward, knocking one of the men off balance, and Ronnie took that split second to act. He grabbed a rock from the ground and threw it at the second man, distracting him long enough to grab the notebook from his bag and run toward the edge of the cliff. "Get back here," the first man shouted, but Ronnie was already moving, the dog right behind him. He could hear the men chasing, but the narrow path down the cliffside gave them little room to follow. Ronnie reached a small ledge halfway down and jumped across to the next one, the dog leaping with him. He looked back and saw the men hesitating at the edge, clearly not willing to risk following them down. "Not today," Ronnie said, turning to continue down the cliffside. The men shouted in frustration, but Ronnie and the dog were already out of their reach. They moved swiftly down, their feet sure on the rocky path. As they reached the bottom, Ronnie felt a sense of relief wash over him. They were safe for now. "We need to call the police," Ronnie said, pulling out his phone. "But first we get the evidence to the right people." The dog barked once, as if agreeing. They had won this round, but Ronnie knew it was far from over. He was closer to uncovering the full scope of the operation and stopping it for good. Ronnie sat on the edge of the cliff, looking out at the city below. The night was quiet, the only sound coming from the wind rustling through the trees. The dog sat beside him, its head resting on Ronnie's knee as they both caught their breath. They had just narrowly escaped the men and uncovered the operation they had been running, but there was still work to be done. Ronnie pulled out the notebook and the device from his bag, looking at the maps and coordinates one more time. The final drop points were clear now, and he knew exactly where the men had been planning to deliver the last shipment. It was too dangerous to let them go any further, and he was determined to put an end to it. "We've done a lot already, buddy," Ronnie said, patting the dog's head. "But it's not over yet." The dog barked softly, as if understanding, and wagged its tail. It had been with him through everything, guiding him through the woods, leading him to hidden clues, and saving him when they were cornered. Ronnie had no doubt the dog was more than just a pet. It was a partner, a true hero. Ronnie looked at the phone in his hand, finally deciding it was time to call the police. He dialed the number, hoping they would be able to handle the operation now that they had all the evidence. After a few rings, the phone was answered. "This is Officer Henderson. How can I help you?" "Officer, this is Ronnie Reynolds. I have important information about a large smuggling operation happening near the outskirts of the city. I've got coordinates, maps, and evidence that could help you stop them." There was a pause on the other end, then a quick reply. "We've been investigating that group for weeks. Where are you now?" Ronnie gave them the details of the location, the cliffside where he had been hiding, and the final drop point. "I'll send you the evidence," he said, "but you need to act fast. They're planning one last shipment, and it could be happening any time." "We're on it. Stay where you are. We'll be there soon," the officer replied before hanging up. Ronnie tucked his phone back into his pocket, feeling a sense of relief. The police were on their way, and soon the men would be caught. The dog stood up beside him, ready to go. "Come on," Ronnie said, getting to his feet. "We've done our part. Now let's make sure they don't get away." They walked down the trail, heading back toward the road where they had parked earlier. The night was still, and Ronnie couldn't help but think back on everything that had led them here. The abandoned warehouse, the hidden shipments, the danger, and the dog that had led him through it all. When they reached the car, Ronnie opened the door and got in the dog, jumping into the passenger seat next to him. He started the engine and pulled away, heading toward the police station to meet with the officers and give them the final pieces of the puzzle. As they drove, Ronnie reflected on everything that had happened. He had started out just trying to get in a morning jog, but now he had uncovered a criminal operation and helped bring it to an end. He knew that without the dog, none of it would have been possible. The dog had been his guide, his protector, and his partner in this crazy adventure. Soon, Ronnie arrived at the station, where he was greeted by the police officers who had been waiting for him. They quickly took the evidence from his bag, the maps, the notebook, the device, and the photos, and began going over everything. "Thanks to you, we've got everything we need to take them down," Officer Henderson said. "We'll be rating the drop points immediately. You did a great job." Ronnie smiled, feeling a sense of pride wash over him. "I couldn't have done it without him," he said, looking down at the dog who was sitting quietly by his side. The officers chuckled. "Looks like you've got a real hero with you." Ronnie nodded. "Yeah, he's been a hero from the start." The police moved quickly, dispatching teams to handle the raids and arrest the men behind the operation. As Ronnie and the dog watched from a distance, he felt a sense of relief settle over him. It was over. The men would be arrested, the operation shut down, and the city would be safe once again. The dog barked softly, wagging its tail, as if understanding that their work was done. Ronnie bent down and patted its head. "We did it, buddy. We saved the day." They stood there for a few more minutes, watching as the police moved in, knowing that the criminals would be caught and justice would be served. Ronnie had no idea what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: he and the dog were a team, and together they could face anything. As they turned to leave, Ronnie glanced down at the dog. "You're not just my pet, you're my partner, and I couldn't ask for a better one." With that, they walked away from the police station, ready for whatever came next. They had saved the day, and their bond had only grown stronger. Whatever adventure awaited them, they would face it together.